It's nice to see so many of you here. My name is Christoph Winkler from Boku University in Vienna. I'm happy to chair this session this morning. And I hope you had a nice last night and fun in putting the music and welfare approach into practice. And I hope you have all recovered sufficiently from it again, or some of you at least. We are going to have a first plenary, and then this is then followed by a joint ISAE EAAP session. So we will have then presentations shared between the EAP conference in Porto, in Portugal, and here, but I will talk a bit more about this later. We will now start with plenary given by Daniel Mills. It will be a pre-recorded presentation because Daniel is experiencing or might be experiencing problems with electricity due to a heavy thunderstorm going on in his area. So this will be pre-recorded, but then hopefully he will be online for the questions. So we can start with the presentation, please.
About an approach to the assessment of animal behaviour that we've been developing over the last 25 years or so. It's called the psychobiological approach simply because it used concepts from both psychology and biology in order to synthesise an approach that can be used in clinical animal behaviour to assess the problem in front of us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, but also some key concepts, and in particular dwell on the issue of motivation emotion before talking about its wider applications in applied ethology. An important thing to appreciate is this approach developed out of a need to be able to be more scientific in the way that we assess problem behaviour in the animals that we see in our clinic. And so we're focused on explaining the behaviour of individuals. Often owners will say, I've treated all my animals the same, why is this one different? We're trying to understand why one animal behaves in a particular way where another animal in a similar situation may behave differently. And this obviously has important clinical applications. If you get it wrong, then it can result in serious injury. So it's very much focused on understanding the behaviour of individuals, and that's one of the things that drove the whole process. Second thing to appreciate is that when we're dealing with animals in the clinic, we need to make immediate decisions. Whilst it's great to be able to undertake experiments over an extended period of time, we don't have the luxury of doing that when we're dealing with a particular clinical case. We have to make decisions there and then to help the owners. This highlights an important difference between the routine research that we do and the clinical practice that we operate. So from these pragmatic requirements, there are two important emphases that come out of the psychobiological approach. First of all, the emphasis on explaining the behaviour of the individual means there's been a lot of attention given to the role of emotions and the individualisation of behaviour. And secondly, the need to make immediate decisions means that we recognise that we're working in a world of uncertainty, and our diagnoses are hypotheses that are constantly being re-evaluated. And that lends quite well to the scientific method that we'll all be familiar with, but it's actually done in a much shorter time scale. So it's an iterative process. An important thing to appreciate is that the clinical animal behaviour, dealing with problem behaviour in animals, is a relatively new discipline, and it doesn't have a consistent approach. If you're interested in the history of this, then myself and the late Roger Eubank wrote a chapter in the ISAE book, Animals and Us, and I'll give the full reference at the end of this talk. One of the things that is apparent when we look at the history of clinical animal behaviour is that there are perhaps 4 approaches that are used to describe problem behaviour, and it's worth just pausing and thinking about these in more detail. The first is the medical approach, and I've previously critiqued this, and that basically sees problem behaviour as pathological brain states. And it's an approach that is perhaps most familiar to veterinarians, where they constantly deal with disease. It sees behaviour problems as disorders that need physical intervention. So it's also rooted in a very positivist philosophy. The second approach is what may be described as the behavioural approach. Behaviour without a U, because it is related to behaviourism, the discipline of looking at the contingencies between environment and behaviour. Here the focus is just on poor learning and interactions with the environment, and it's an approach that is widely used by a lot of trainers. A third approach that you will often perhaps hear referred to, particularly in the horse world, is what we might call a typological approach. This is where the problems as faults in the animal's personality or temperament. So the reason why this horse is cribbing is because it's got a poor temperament. We might refer to the cribbing behaviour as a vice. The fourth approach is the psychobiological approach, which is a synthesis of a lot of the information contained in these other approaches, but it uses ideas from evolutionary biology and sees the behaviour of animals as largely adaptive, even if it is an unusual environment, and also takes ideas of psychological constructs in order to improve our ability to predict the behaviour of the animal, to make those immediate decisions in the clinic. An important thing to appreciate here is that the labels we use to describe something affect the way we think about it. So if we refer to something as a vice, then the emphasis is very much on the horse. So we have a range of different approaches here. I say, if you think of cribbing in the horse, from a medical approach, people will be focusing on things like the sensitivity of dopamine receptors, and there's a wealth of research in relation to that. From a behavioural point of view, the behavioural approach, people will emphasise the role of learning and feeding and environmental features on the development of the problem. A typological approach will describe it as a vice and perhaps say there's little that can be done about it, whereas a psychobiological approach seeks to understand why the horse is doing that behaviour and that particular horse in a particular circumstance, to see what we can tease out from both the biology of the horse but also its psychology in order to be able to help it. Something that became very apparent to me early on in working in the field of clinical animal behaviour is the problems with the labels that we use to describe the problems. As I said, how we describe something affects the way that we think about it. And in the first International Veterinary Behaviour meeting, which was in 1997, so just 25 years ago, I flagged this point, and this is what perhaps led me to try and develop a better approach to deal with things. And I just want to give you an example of the sort of issue that we were seeing at that time, but also something that is still prevalent in the way that we describe behaviour. I looked at the diagnostic labels used to describe aggressive behaviour in dogs in the literature of many of the key opinion leaders and thought leaders in the field at the time. And it became apparent that people were using very different terms to describe this phenomenon. And I list them here. When you look more closely, what became apparent was that it seemed to be an agreement that all dogs could show predatory aggression, which actually is considered completely different to effective aggression. So that's one thing that could be agreed on, that dogs bite when they want to kill something, but that shouldn't be confused with effective aggression. The other thing that they seem to agree on is that dogs bite when they're scared, and that's fear-induced or similar sorts of labels. So there seemed to be a consensus there. And another label that was relatively common was some sort of intraspecific, inter-male, inter-female, or social form of aggression was going on. But when you look at these terms, they are very different levels of explanation. So predatory aggression describes the motivation of the animal trying to get prey. Fear-induced relates to emotion, and social or intraspecific, inter-male or inter-female describes the context. And if we describe things at different levels like that, then it's not surprising that animals come out with multiple diagnoses. Is it possible that an animal could be engaged in intraspecific aggression and be fearful, for example? They're not distinct. And this highlights the sort of problem with the labels that were being used. We need to clearly distinguish motivation, emotion, as well as context. And not treat them or confuse them with each other. The third key principle here in the development of this approach was the need for our constructs to have a scientific rationale rooted in both biology and also psychology. And I want to say a little bit more about that now. Some of the key concepts that are important here. Well, I work in a department of biological sciences, and I'm constantly reminded by my colleagues that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So it's important that actually we can understand the behaviour of the animals in the context of evolutionary forces that may be shaping it. It's not adequate to simply say that it's pathology, but even pathologies have roots in evolution. From a psychological perspective, we've paid a lot of attention to key psychological constructs because we see them as useful variables that help us predict the behaviour of the individual. We recognise that animals have a limited behavioural repertoire, but that is used flexibly, i.e. they can use a given behaviour in order to achieve or signal different functions. The second principle is to appreciate that we do not respond to the physical realities of the world, but rather our minds actively create our own individualized world, what's often referred to as Umwelt. And this changes through our interaction with it. So once we develop a particular view of the world, then our behavior is shaped by that. If we see something as scary, then we're likely to avoid it. And unless we carefully manage the situation, the animal is likely to remain fearful. And it will respond to a particular stimulus in a very different way to an animal that does not view the stimulus as fearful. The key to this is categorization, which is central to perception, that we categorize the world around us, but we don't just categorize it on the basis of physical properties like color and form. We also categorize it on the basis of what the meaning is to us as well. And this forms one of the central bases of understanding emotional behavior. So categorizing something as potentially a threat to us results in a fear response. This is what we mean when we talk about the affordance property of an emotionally competent stimulus. And it's called an emotionally competent stimulus because it is a stimulus that's capable of eliciting an emotion. It's not bound to release the emotion. It depends on the wider environment in those situations. The third principle in psychology that we need to appreciate is that we cannot measure internal psychological state. We can only infer it from gathering objective data and logical reasoning. So we have to recognize that our inferences, our diagnoses, our inferences about the emotion or motivational state of the individual are working hypotheses that are continuously being tested in the light of new information. If we implement a treatment program and the animal starts to get better, then that itself helps us evaluate the diagnosis. Likewise, if it doesn't get better, that is useful information and we reevaluate our hypotheses accordingly. So understanding uncertainty and seeing the gathering of knowledge as a process to reduce uncertainty rather than establish facts is key to understanding the underlying principles of the psychobiological approach. And finally, it's important to appreciate that as our understanding of different psychological constructs grows, so our definition of them changes. There is key terminology like emotion and motivation that needs to be defined. There is no consensus on emotion. Whilst we might all know what an emotion is, we do not, as scientists or even as the public, agree on what an emotion is, how many emotions there are, or how they're actually formed. So it's important that we define that key terminology. And this is a common issue in applied ethology when it comes to terms like stress, etc. They have a long history of confusion and inconsistency that has hindered scientific progress. So now I'd like to talk about the key concepts of motivation and emotion and their role in the control of behaviour from a psychobiological perspective. Motivation is seen as the psychobiological processes, i.e. psychological and biological, including physiological processes that control actions for which there is a single explicit goal that is being pursued, i.e. we're focusing on a particular behaviour. Now, often in ethology, people have talked about motivational state and a whole range of behaviours. That is something actually that from a psychobiological perspective I would align more closely with emotion than motivation. When we're talking about motivation from a psychobiological perspective, we're focusing on a particular behaviour. And as I said, the biological process include the physiology, the neuroendocrine of the action, and the psychological process include the representations of the goals of the behaviour in particular. And also, when we study motivation, we're also interested, because of the goal, we're interested in reinforcement effects that might help us understand the goal. When we talk about emotion, then there is a synthesis from a range of different disciplines, not only affective systems from Panksepp, which many of you will be familiar with, but also from key biological literature and psychological literature as well. So the key psychological literature that we draw on is particularly component process theory, originally proposed by Shearer, and I'll talk more about that shortly. But it is emotion that results in the individualization of behavior, but also sets the tone for behavioral strategies, i.e. it creates biases in behavior that makes us behave in a particular way, or encourages us, perhaps I should say, to behave in a particular way. Those behaviors have various characteristics that show that they're emotional, because not all behavior is necessarily emotional, and I'll come back to that later on. They are persistent, they are scalable, i.e. they vary in intensity, and they have features of generalization as well. And the important thing to appreciate is we can get emotional response not just to the presence of a stimulus or a change in this particular stimulus, but also from its predicted presence or absence. And that does pose challenges in making inferences, but I'll show in a little while how we can address that issue when it comes to clinical assessment. So when we think about assessing behaviour, we recognise three elements: the context of the behaviour, when and where it occurs, with whom, etc. The motivation for the behaviour, which in shorthand we can think of as a specific goal of a given action, and the emotional basis to behaviour, the personal basis to the strategies which that behaviour forms part of. We're often looking to explain a suite of behaviours when we're dealing with problem behaviour, but we're interested in why this particular individual behaves in a particular way. And it's by evaluating each of these that we can think about offering more rational and precise treatment interventions. In some situations, it may be most appropriate to address the motivation for the behaviour. In other situations, maybe where you want to change the animal's underlying emotion, and as a result, change the sorts of behaviours that are being shown. In some situations, where you wish to change context. In this picture here, you can see a variety of devices used to control repetitive behaviour in horses, and the emphasis on understanding emotion highlights why these are not appropriate treatments. Using a spike collar might reduce the behaviour, but it does so at a real welfare cost. Likewise, doing surgery to cut the muscles to prevent a horse from cribbing doesn't do anything about the motivation for the behaviour. And that's why this approach is also important for vets to appreciate. It's not just about solving the behaviour, we need to think about its underlying consequences. And that's what the psychobiological approach allows us to do. It allows us to fully appreciate the welfare implications of both the behaviour, but also potential treatment recommendations. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we go about assessing motivation at a practical level. And we draw on the principles of applied behavioural analysis. And this often refers to an assessment of ABC, the antecedents, the behaviour and its consequences. And within a typical applied behavioural analysis, we make that assessment in order to identify the stimuli that can control the behaviour. However, within the psychobiological approach, we actually do something quite different. It is important to identify the stimuli that can control the behaviour, but actually we do exactly what a behaviourist doesn't want to do. We try to make inferences about internal state, i.e. infer the motivation for this behaviour. So we now have a testable hypothesis that we can re-examine in light of the animal's clinical history and response to treatment. When it comes to the assessment of emotion, then that initial observation of the antecedents of the behaviour itself and its consequences is quite important. But actually, by referring to component process theory, we see that there are 4 areas where we can gather information to produce testable hypotheses in order to evaluate whether or not a particular emotion might be involved in a situation. And those 4 pillars are the context, the arousal of the individual, the behavioural tendencies shown by the individual, and the communicative signals being shown by the individual. I'm going to take each of these in turn. So I mentioned the concept of emotionally competent stimuli. These are the contexts which potentially result in a behaviour. And the question we ask ourselves is, are there environmental circumstances that could suggest that a particular type of emotion might be involved? And we broadly recognise 9 different types of emotion at a pragmatic level. Now, the experience of emotions is much more complex than this, and we might want to argue that there are more or less than 9 key emotions that we need to consider. But this is a useful working model at the moment. There are non-social emotions like seeking or desire, frustration, fear, anxiety, and pain. They're associated with different types of environments which have a particular meaning to the animal, and that's what we mean by affordance quality. There are also 5 social emotions. And these key elements are social emotions associated with bonding within groups, attachment figures, which are sources of safety, dependents, those in need of support, so offspring, etc., sexual partners, and then there are undesirables, those that you want to reject from your social group. So this provides 9 different classes that can result in an emotional reaction, and I've listed them in these slides. Let's now consider the issue of arousal. An emotional response is associated with a certain arousal level. As I said previously, it is scalable and extends beyond the immediate behavioural response. So it's switched on neurologically, but it's switched off endocrinologically. If we don't see that sort of extension of arousal, then it would question whether or not the response has much of an emotional context. If we think about a particular stimulus in the environment, it is evaluated and it might result in one or other emotional response in order to deal with it. However, if a particular response, emotional response and behaviour results in predictably successful outcome, then actually the feedback from that response is that this is the response that goes in this particular circumstance. And as a result, we can see that the behaviour becomes more habitual or unemotional. And this reduces the cognitive load associated with evaluating the environment, which is one of the key constraints on the activities of the brain. So a behaviour may start off as being emotional, but if the environmental feedback is highly predictable for a particular behaviour and successful, then it may become much more routine and less emotional. Let's now look at the behavioural tendencies. As I said, emotional responses result in certain biases in our responses. And if we consider a response that results in fear, then we're going to get behavioural tendencies associated with the avoidance of potential harm, escape, self-defence, and particularly self-defence will occur if the animal cannot reach a point of safety. And that highlights how different emotions, these are not entirely distinct, but they often interact together, because if I can't get to safety, then elements of frustration are going to kick in as well. So the experience that we have is not based on simple modular emotions, but actually a blend of different emotional states, given the complexity of the environment that we live in. And this is important because perhaps in the laboratory we may be able to isolate these, but in the real world we're in a very multisensory experience. Likewise, there are certain behavioural tendencies that are associated with different social emotions as well that I mention here. The fourth pillar from which we gather evidence are looking at the communicative signals. Now, this is something that is widely talked about in relation to sort of the popular media, but also some of the scientific. But actually the scientific evidence for communicative signals and their meaning is much poorer. What is becoming apparent is that with a limited behavioural repertoire, then when an animal uses a particular display, they may reduce the uncertainty of a message, but looking at the general display, that is not likely to be very diagnostic, or it's not going to be 100% specific. And we need to get away from the idea that this behaviour means has this particular meaning. What is perhaps more useful is to look at the frequency with which that signal or display is made, or the style. And that's what I mean by the macro signal, is the general feature. So, for example, a dog wagging its tail. Wagging its tail doesn't have a single meaning. But when we start to look at some of the more micro behaviors or micro features of wagging the tail, we may get to a more specific interpretation. So, for example, there is work to show that lateralization in wagging tail may reflect the emotional state of the dog, which is associated with the different hemispheres of the brain having different roles in positive versus negative emotion. And thirdly, there may be composite signals which help to reduce uncertainty. So the meaning of a signal can only be understood by looking at the wider picture as well. So what other signals are being issued? So we might be looking at the tail of the dog, but we also need to look at the dog's face as well in order to understand what it is trying to say. These all help to reduce the uncertainty. And it's by taking the information from these four pillars, the context of the behavior, the arousal levels, the behavioral tendencies and the communicative signals, we can test the hypothesis saying, is this consistent with this emotion? And using a scientific approach, we can falsify. If the answer is clearly no, then we have to reject the idea that that particular emotion is involved in a particular case. I want to just finish by considering the issue of repetitive behaviours and show you how a psychobiological perspective can help us in the research that we do, from both a clinical but also from a pure research perspective as well. And please note, I'm calling it repetitive behaviours. I'm not calling it stereotypy, and I'm not calling it compulsive disorders, because they are diagnoses. Our starting point is always to start with the description of what is going on. We are seeing repetitive behaviour. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, why is the animal being repetitive? There must be a recurrence or continued presence of the proximate triggers of the behaviour, and they can be internal or external. So, and there can be a shift between those over time. So if we take the case of a dog that is licking its paw, it might initially do that as a displacement behaviour associated with conflict. But with time, as it licks its paw, it may push the hair shafts into the skin that result in an infection in the skin, what's known as a pyoderma. And over time, that can result in chronic changes in the skin. So we're seeing there a shift from an external environmental trigger that results in conflict to potentially a more internal trigger associated with pain, and perhaps streamlining over time as the behaviour changes, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. So let's now think about those different types of triggers. Well, as I've already suggested, there may be medical triggers like pain or irritation. But there can also be sensory pleasures. So, for example, behaviours like grooming are intrinsically rewarding, and that repetitive behaviour may begin as a normally externally triggered event, but become internally triggered as the behaviour shifts function and becomes a goal in itself. So I enjoy doing this behaviour, so I nibble myself. From an external point of view, we can think about external reinforcers. So dogs might do this, for example, for attention seeking, and also the sort of displacement behaviour that I've already mentioned. There are moderators of the response as well. So just understanding the proximate triggers is not adequate. So understanding things like impulse control and the role of serotonergic systems can be important in these situations. And to recognise that thresholds are lowered through repetition, the dopaminergic streamlining. As I said, if a behaviour has a predictable outcome, then it can become less emotional and more habitual. In this case, the final reward becomes less important as the behaviour becomes associated with internal rewards linked to desire rather than reward in itself. And there's an extensive literature on the neurobiology of reward versus desire to underpin this. As a result, the behaviour simplifies and it becomes less environmentally responsive, so it becomes harder to manage. So we need to be able to evaluate the behaviour for these sorts of changes. So just to finish, the psychobiological approach can be used usefully to deepen our understanding of both the behaviour of the individual, but also the heterogeneity of behavioural phenomena. So not just labelling repetitive behaviours that we find inconvenient as stereotypy, for example, which has a diagnostic flavour to it. As I said, the way that the labels we use affect the way we think about things. It also highlights the importance of addressing many of the terminological inconsistencies that afflict applied ethology as a result. And I would argue that it has a strong underpinning scientific philosophy rooted in the concept of hypothesis testing, falsification, and the uncertainty of scientific knowledge. And all that we're doing is providing a systematic scientific framework for testing hypotheses concerning the psychological basis of behaviour, that can be used in both a clinical but also a research context. So thank you for your attention, and I've listed here some key references and further information that you might find useful.